My boss fired me on my birthday. Happy birthday, loser. Pack your desk. The office watched in silence. By noon, I wasn't jobless. He was. Turns out birthdays can be poetic if you plan them right. I'd planned this one for months. The coffee maker sputtered to life at exactly 6:47 a.m., just like every morning for the past 8 months. I stood there in the empty break room watching the dark liquid drip into the pot, knowing that in 13 minutes, Mr. Granger would storm through those glass doors expecting his usual, black coffee, no sugar, served in the blue mug with the company logo that he claimed brought him luck. What he didn't know was that I'd been watching him through those same glass doors since my first day, studying his patterns, his weaknesses, his arrogance. Before we dive deeper into how I orchestrated the perfect revenge, I want to thank you for being here. If you believe toxic bosses should face consequences for their actions, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need justice. Now let's see how this plan unfolded. My name tag read Madison in neat block letters, but most people didn't bother to remember it. To them, I was invisible, the girl who fetched coffee, sorted files, and stayed late without being asked. The one who smiled politely when they dumped extra work on my desk with a dismissive wave. The one who never complained, never pushed back, never caused trouble. Perfect. I started at this company like everyone else. Bottom rung, no one special. At least that's what they thought. During my interview, I'd worn a borrowed blazer from Goodwill and carried a resume printed at the local library. I spoke softly, kept my answers brief, and projected exactly what they expected. Desperation wrapped in gratitude. We're looking for someone who can handle basic administrative tasks, the HR manager had said, barely glancing up from her phone. Filing, copying, general office support. The pay isn't much, but it's a foot in the door. I'd nodded eagerly, clutching my fake leather portfolio. I'm just happy for the opportunity. The lie tasted bitter but necessary. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my father, Logan Mitchell, owned 47% of the entire company. Not Logan the janitor or Logan the accountant. Logan Mitchell, the silent partner whose signature appeared on every major contract, whose approval was needed for every significant decision, whose investment had quite literally built the foundation beneath their feet. I wasn't just there to work. I was there to watch. My mother used to tell me stories about people like Granger when I was little. Sweetheart, she'd say, brushing my hair before bed, people who spend all their time looking up at themselves in mirrors never see the ground shifting beneath their feet. Those are the ones who fall the hardest. She'd been gone for 3 years now, but her words echoed in my mind every time Granger's voice boomed across the office, every time he took credit for someone else's idea, every time he made another employee's life miserable just because he could. Granger was exactly the kind of man my mother had warned me about. The kind who barked orders like a drill sergeant, stole credit with the smoothness of a seasoned politician, and smiled like he owned everything and everyone around him. His corner office had floor-to-ceiling windows, a mahogany desk that cost more than most people's cars, and walls lined with awards he'd never actually earned. He didn't own anything. Not really. But there was one person in this toxic ecosystem who caught my attention from day one. Brad. While everyone else treated me like furniture, Brad actually saw me. He was quiet, almost painfully so, but there was something deliberate about his silence. Something calculating. Extra shot today? He'd ask softly, appearing at my elbow while I prepared the morning coffee service. He always brought me a second cup, perfectly prepared with the exact amount of cream I preferred, though I'd never told him how I liked it. Most people assumed Brad was a temp worker or maybe someone's assistant. He dressed simply, spoke only when spoken to, and seemed to blend into the background during meetings. But I watched him the way I watched everyone else, and I noticed things others missed. The way his eyes tracked every conversation, cataloging information like a human database. How his fingers would pause over his keyboard when Granger made particularly cruel comments, as if he were restraining himself from typing something he shouldn't. The expensive watch he wore. Subtle but worth more than 3 months of my supposed salary. Brad wasn't just another employee grinding away in corporate purgatory. I had a feeling he was much more than that. As it turned out, I wasn't wrong. The company culture was toxic in the way that only corporate environments can be, polished on the surface, rotten underneath. Meetings felt like gladiator matches where the loudest voice won, regardless of logic or merit. Promotions went to whoever could kiss up most effectively while stepping on the most backs. Ideas were stolen so casually that plagiarism had become standard operating procedure. I stayed silent through it all. Smiled when they needed me to smile. Nodded when they needed me to agree. Apologized when they needed someone to blame. But I was always listening. Always watching. Always taking mental notes. When Granger screamed at Sarah from accounting until she cried, I remembered. When he deliberately sabotaged Tom's presentation to make himself look better, I cataloged it. When he made inappropriate comments about female employees during the holiday party, thinking no one important was paying attention, I filed it away with everything else. Every insult, every injustice, every moment of casual cruelty, it all went into my mental archive. A growing collection of evidence that I planned to use when the time was right. Some nights, I'd sit in my actual apartment, not the studio I'd claimed to live in during my interview, and review the day's observations. I'd write everything down in coded shorthand, building a comprehensive picture of exactly who these people really were when they thought no one was watching. My father called every Sunday, always at exactly 8 p.m. "How's the research going, sweetheart?" he'd ask, his voice warm but careful. "Almost ready," I'd tell him. "Just need a little more time." "Take all the time you need. Your mother always said the best revenge is served ice cold." She had said that. Usually while teaching me chess, showing me how to sacrifice pawns to protect the queen, how to think 7 moves ahead while your opponent was still celebrating their last capture. I was learning to play a much bigger game now. One where the stakes were higher than any chess match, where real people's lives hung in the balance, where one perfectly timed move could topple an entire kingdom built on lies and cruelty. But first I had to remain invisible just a little longer. The girl nobody noticed, quietly gathering intelligence, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to reveal that the mouse they'd been ignoring was actually a lioness who'd been studying their every weakness. The coffee finished brewing. Time to start another day of being underestimated. It was exactly where I wanted to be. 3 weeks into my invisible existence, I discovered the true power of being overlooked. It happened during my first real glimpse behind Granger's polished facade, a moment that would haunt me for months. I was delivering quarterly reports to his office when I heard muffled shouting through the heavy oak door. The nameplate gleamed, "Richard Granger, Chief Executive Officer." Inside, his voice rose to a crescendo that made the walls seem to vibrate. "You pathetic excuse for an intern. Do you think this company runs on your daddy's money and your participation trophies?" I pressed closer to the door, my heart hammering. Through the crack, I could see a young woman, maybe 19, fresh-faced and trembling, clutching a stack of papers to her chest like armor. Her lip quivered as Granger circled her like a predator. "I'm sorry, Mr. Granger," she whispered. "I can redo the analysis. I just need more time to..." "Time." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Time is money, sweetheart. And you've just cost me both." The girl's shoulders shook. A single tear traced down her cheek, and I watched her carefully wipe it away, trying to maintain some dignity in the face of his cruelty. Most people don't realize how much you can learn from being invisible. In that moment, I understood that my position wasn't just strategic, it was essential. I was witnessing the real Richard Granger, stripped of his boardroom charm and public relations smile. 2 days later, I watched that same intern clear out her desk. Her supervisor, Janet, explained quietly that the girl had failed to meet performance standards. But I'd seen her work. It was meticulous, thorough, better than half the senior analysts produced. The following month brought an even more devastating revelation. Lisa Martinez, a single mother from the accounting department, was called into Granger's office on a Friday afternoon. I was organizing files in the adjacent conference room when her voice drifted through the shared wall. "Please, Mr. Granger. I know the project went over budget, but I can make it right. I have 2 kids and this job." "Should have thought about that before you screwed up," came his cold response. What followed was the sound of a woman's quiet sobbing, punctuated by Granger's harsh laughter. Not just amusement, genuine pleasure at her pain. The sound made my stomach turn, but I forced myself to listen, to memorize every inflection, every cruel word. "Tears don't pay invoices, Lisa. Pack your things." I recorded nothing during these moments. My phone remained tucked away, my hands empty. But I listened with the intensity of a court stenographer, committing every detail to memory. Each conversation became another thread in the web I was slowly weaving. The real breakthrough came during the 3rd month, when I was assigned to shadow Granger for an entire week. Executive observation, they called it, a development opportunity for promising junior staff. If they only knew how promising I actually was. He forgot I was there half the time, treating me like a piece of furniture that occasionally fetched coffee. During a budget meeting, I watched him casually redirect funds allocated for employee safety equipment into his personal entertainment budget. $30,000 that should have purchased updated fire suppression systems instead went toward his country club membership renewal. "Who's going to check?" he muttered to his assistant, unaware that I was standing 3 feet away ostensibly organizing files. "The board trusts me completely." The irony was almost too perfect to believe. But it was during that same week that I witnessed something that changed everything. Thursday afternoon, Granger called Brad into his office. I was stationed at the copy machine directly outside, feeding documents through the scanner while straining to hear their conversation. Brad had spent weeks developing a revolutionary design proposal, a sustainability initiative that could have saved the company millions while dramatically reducing environmental impact. I'd seen him working late into the evening, refining calculations, perfecting presentations, pouring his expertise into something truly innovative. Through the glass partition, I watched Granger flip through Brad's carefully prepared materials. His expression shifted from boredom to disdain to something approaching disgust. "This is garbage," he declared, loud enough for half the floor to hear. Absolute garbage. What happened next unfolded in slow motion. Granger lifted the entire proposal. Months of research, detailed schematics, financial projections, and methodically tore each page in half. The sound of ripping paper filled the office like gunshots. "Environmental responsibility doesn't pay bonuses," he sneered, feeding the shredded remains into his personal document destroyer. "Stick to what you know, Brad." Filing and staying quiet. Throughout this humiliation, Brad's expression never changed. He stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back, watching his work disappear into mechanical teeth. But I was close enough to see what Granger missed. The subtle tightening of Brad's jaw, the way his knuckles went white, the dangerous stillness that settled over his features. I wanted to scream. To march into that office and reveal exactly who I was. To watch Granger's face crumble when he realized what he'd just done. But my mother's voice echoed in my mind, reminding me that the most powerful strikes come from unexpected angles. We weren't ready. Yet. Instead, I began expanding my intelligence network beyond the corporate hierarchy. The cleaning staff became my most valuable allies. Maria, who emptied Granger's trash and often found incriminating documents he'd carelessly discarded. The night shift engineers, who witnessed executive-level conversations during supposedly private after-hours meetings. The security guards who saw everything but were rarely asked to speak. These invisible workers had stories that would make headlines. Jenny, the assistant who'd been systematically harassed until she requested a transfer to another department. Marcus, the facilities manager who'd been forced to falsify inspection reports to avoid unnecessary expenses. Patricia, the receptionist who'd been threatened with termination for refusing to lie to her husband about Granger's whereabouts during his affair with a board member's wife. I wrote everything down in a coded journal I kept locked in my desk drawer. Not just the major incidents but the smaller cruelties that revealed character. The way Granger treated service workers, his casual racism disguised as business decisions, his complete disregard for employee well-being. This wasn't just about personal revenge anymore. It was about justice for every person he'd trampled while climbing his ladder of success. My father's weekly check-ins became my anchor during this period. He never called, too traceable. Instead, handwritten notes appeared in my mailbox, always in his distinctive script, always containing exactly the guidance I needed. "Patience is a scalpel, not a hammer," read one particularly memorable message. "Precision cuts deeper than force." His words became my compass, guiding me through moments when rage threatened to overwhelm strategy. I wasn't going to scream my accusations from rooftops or confront Granger in dramatic boardroom showdowns. I was going to slice carefully, methodically, with surgical precision. And when I was finished, there would be nothing left but the truth. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. I'd been planning this day for 8 months, 17 days and roughly 6 hours. Every detail choreographed, every contingency mapped, every emotion carefully controlled. What I hadn't anticipated was how ordinary it would feel when the moment finally came. The office buzzed with its usual Monday morning energy. Keyboards clicking, coffee brewing, phones ringing in their endless corporate symphony. I sat at my desk, hands steady as I typed up meaningless reports, watching the clock tick toward 10:30 a.m. That's when Granger typically made his rounds, strutting through the office like a peacock displaying his feathers. At 10:27, I heard his voice booming from the executive wing. My pulse quickened, but not from fear. From anticipation. "Madison." His voice cut through the office chatter like a blade. "Conference room. Now." I stood slowly, smoothing my skirt, feeling every eye in the office turn toward me. This was theater now, and I had a role to play. The confused, nervous employee who had no idea what was coming. But as I walked toward the conference room, I noticed something that made my heart skip. Someone had decorated the break room table with a small birthday cake. Vanilla with pink frosting, the kind you'd buy at a grocery store. A handful of balloons bobbed nearby, and a few coworkers stood around awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable but trying to be kind. Sarah from accounting caught my eye and mouthed, "Happy birthday," with a sad smile. She didn't know what was about to happen, but somehow she sensed it wouldn't be good. "Everyone gather around," Granger announced, his voice carrying that false cheer he used when he wanted an audience for his cruelty. "We're celebrating Madison's special day." The office slowly assembled in the break room, a reluctant congregation for whatever performance Granger had planned. I counted faces, 23 people including myself. 23 witnesses to what he clearly intended as my public humiliation. "Madison," he began, that predatory smile spreading across his face, "today marks not just your birthday but also a very special announcement." I stood perfectly still, hands clasped in front of me, projecting the image of a deer caught in headlights. Inside, every nerve was alive with electric anticipation. "Happy birthday, loser," he said, his voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence like a gunshot. The words echoed off the walls, hanging in the air long enough for everyone to absorb their casual cruelty. The room went silent. Someone's coffee cup clinked against a saucer. A phone rang unanswered in the distance. "Pack your desk," he continued, louder now, feeding off the audience's discomfort. "We're downsizing, and I figured we'd start with the dead weight." His laughter filled the space, sharp, triumphant, designed to wound. A few people chuckled nervously, the sound hollow and forced. Most looked down at their shoes, unwilling to meet my eyes, ashamed to be witnessing this moment but powerless to stop it. I searched the crowd for Brad. He stood near the back, expression completely neutral, hands in his pockets. While others shifted uncomfortably or averted their gazes, he watched Granger with the calm attention of someone studying an interesting specimen. He didn't even flinch. "Well," Granger prompted, clearly expecting tears, protests, maybe even begging. "Don't you have anything to say? No birthday speech?" I said nothing. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, vibrating with tension that only I understood. "Jennifer," Granger called to his assistant, "get her a box. She'll need something to carry her things." Jennifer appeared with a cardboard box, the kind used for office supplies now repurposed for my supposed shame. She handed it to me with apologetic eyes, mouthing, "I'm sorry," so quietly only I could see. I took the box without a word, feeling its weight, noting the irony. This box would become a prop in my performance, a symbol of what everyone thought was my defeat. The walk to my desk felt like a funeral procession. My coworkers parted before me, creating a path lined with pitying stares and uncomfortable shuffles. Some whispered behind their hands. Others pretended to be busy with their work, unable to watch what they believed was my public destruction. At my desk, I paused, surveying the personal items I'd carefully arranged over the past 8 months. Most were decoys, generic decorations meant to create the illusion of someone who actually belonged here, someone who had invested emotionally in this place. I took exactly 4 things, each selection deliberate and meaningful. First, the framed photo of my parents. My father in his navy suit, my mother in her pearl necklace, both smiling at some long-ago charity gala. The photo served dual purposes. It showed my human side to watching coworkers while secretly reminding me of my true purpose here. Second, my notebook. Black leather, unremarkable from the outside, but filled with months of careful observations written in coded shorthand. Every conversation, every incident, every piece of evidence I'd gathered was documented in those pages. Third, my pen. A simple ballpoint that had signed countless meaningless memos while secretly recording the information that would change everything. Fourth, and most importantly, my access badge. The plastic card that identified me as Madison, administrative assistant. What it didn't show was the authorization level coded into its magnetic strip. Access granted not to Madison the coffee girl, but to Madison Logan, daughter of the company's largest shareholder. I placed these items carefully in the box, ignoring the weight of 23 pairs of eyes watching my every movement. Someone had started crying. I thought it might be Sarah, but I didn't look up to confirm. This wasn't the time for comfort or reassurance. As I lifted the box and turned toward the exit, I caught a glimpse of Brad at his desk. Our eyes met for exactly 3 seconds. He gave me the smallest possible nod. Barely a movement at all, but it carried the weight of months of shared understanding. That was all. But I understood perfectly. We had waited long enough. The pieces were in position. The board was set. It was time. I walked toward the elevator, carrying my box of carefully chosen props, feeling the weight of their stares and the lightness of impending victory. Behind me, I heard Granger's voice resuming its normal volume. The show over, the audience dismissed. He had no idea that his performance was just the opening act. At noon I returned. The elevator doors opened on the executive floor and I stepped out transformed. Gone was the meek administrative assistant in her discount blazer and uncomfortable flats. In her place stood Madison Logan. Clean lines, perfect posture, expensive heels clicking against marble floors with the confidence of someone who belonged here. My hair was pulled back in a sleek bun. No makeup. I wanted my face to be unmistakably clear when the truth was revealed. I carried one folder, manila and unremarkable, containing 8 months of surgical precision. The receptionist looked up as I approached the boardroom doors. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by something that looked like relief. "They're waiting for you," she said quietly, and I knew she wasn't just talking about the board meeting. She'd been waiting for this moment too. Everyone had. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors to find 12 faces turning toward me in perfect synchronization. The boardroom was a monument to corporate power, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A table that could seat 20 and walls lined with portraits of past executives who'd shaped the company's legacy. Granger sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, legs crossed with casual arrogance, one hand gesturing as he spoke. Mid-sentence his eyes found mine. The words died on his lips. For a heartbeat, confusion flickered across his features. Then recognition. Then something approaching panic. "You," he said, half rising from his chair. "You don't belong in here." I stepped fully into the room, my heels clicking against polished marble with deliberate precision. The manila folder in my hands felt weightless despite containing enough evidence to destroy him completely. "You're absolutely right," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I don't belong here as Madison the coffee girl." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I could hear the whisper of expensive fabric as board members shifted in their leather chairs, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. "My name," I continued, walking slowly toward the table, "is Madison Logan." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the blood drain from Granger's face as the implications crashed over him like a tsunami. "My father, Logan Mitchell, owns 47% of this company." I placed the folder gently on the polished table. "And I believe you've all met me over the past 8 months, as the girl who fetched your coffee." The room erupted in a chaos of whispers and sharp intakes of breath. Harold Brennan, the silver-haired board member seated to Granger's left, choked on his water, sending droplets across his legal pad. Margaret Chen, the company's lead counsel, leaned forward with laser-focused attention, already calculating legal ramifications. "That's impossible," Granger sputtered, finding his voice again. "Logan Mitchell doesn't have a daughter. I've met him dozens of times and he's never mentioned me." I smiled, the expression cold and precise. How shocking. Almost like it was intentional. Before Granger could formulate another protest, movement caught my attention from the far end of the table. Brad, quiet, invisible Brad, was standing up with the fluid grace of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but carrying a new authority that made every head turn. "I believe there's been a significant oversight in today's introductions." Granger's eyes darted between us, confusion mixing with growing horror. Brad, sit down. This is obviously some kind of elaborate. My name is Brad Morrison, he interrupted, stepping into the light streaming through the windows. My mother is Amber Morrison. The second bomb detonated with even more devastating effect than the first. Amber Morrison, the company's second-largest shareholder. The mysterious investor who'd remained silent for years while accumulating 43% of voting shares. The woman whose approval was required for any major corporate decision but who'd never attended a single board meeting. She owns 43% of this company, Brad continued with the same measured calm he'd used to bring me coffee every morning. And yes, Mr. Granger, I've also been here for 8 months. Watching. Bernie. Documenting. Granger's face had gone from pale to gray, then to a sickly shade of green. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. We second the motion, Brad said, his eyes meeting mine across the table with perfect understanding. The motion. The vote of no confidence that had been called for this emergency session. The reason all 12 board members were present on what should have been a quiet Monday afternoon. Margaret Chin cleared her throat, her legal training kicking in despite the shock. Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Morrison, before we proceed, we'll need verification of your identities and... I opened the manila folder with deliberate care. Everything you need is right here. The documents I spread across the table represented months of meticulous preparation. Birth certificates with official seals. DNA verification reports commissioned by the finest private laboratories. Legal authorizations granting us proxy voting rights for our parents' shares. Every piece of paperwork required to prove beyond doubt that we were exactly who we claimed to be. But that was just the foundation. The real payload came in the form of time-stamped emails dating back 18 months, internal reports that had been buried or ignored, and testimony from 47 current and former employees. Every conversation I'd overheard, every document Maria had retrieved from Granger's trash, every incident witnessed by the invisible army of workers he'd overlooked and mistreated. These are transcripts of recorded conversations, I explained, watching board members lean forward to examine the evidence. This is documentation of fund misappropriation. These are safety violations that were deliberately concealed. Brad moved to stand beside me, pulling his own folder from seemingly nowhere. Financial irregularities dating back 3 years. Fraudulent reporting to investors. Violation of federal employment law on 17 separate occasions. The papers scattered across the table like scattered pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, revealed the complete picture of Richard Granger's corruption. Harold Brennan picked up a document with shaking hands. This says he redirected $40,000 from employee safety equipment to personal entertainment expenses? Country club membership, I confirmed, while the fire suppression system in the East Wing remained dangerously outdated. Margaret Chin was speed reading through legal violations, her expression growing more grim with each page. Sexual harassment complaints that were buried. Wrongful termination lawsuits that were settled with non-disclosure agreements paid from company funds rather than his personal assets. All of this is fabricated, Granger said, but his voice lacked conviction. These two have obviously conspired to. To what? Brad asked quietly. To spend 8 months documenting your actual behavior? To record conversations you had in your own office. The audio recordings are time-stamped and verified, I added. Including your conversation this morning where you called me a loser in front of 23 witnesses. The room fell silent except for the soft rustle of papers as board members continued examining the evidence. I could see the calculation happening behind their eyes. The legal exposure, the financial liability, the reputation damage that keeping Granger would cost them. Margaret Chin looked up from the documents. Given the severity of these allegations and the substantial evidence presented, I move for an immediate vote of no confidence. Seconded, said Harold Brennan without hesitation. All in favor? Hands rose around the table like dominoes falling in sequence. One by one, each board member chose justice over loyalty, evidence over friendship, future over past. The count was 9-0. Richard Granger, Margaret Chin announced with the formality of a judge delivering a verdict. You are hereby stripped of your position as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. Security appeared as if summoned by telepathy, 2 professional guards who moved with quiet efficiency. Granger's access badge was deactivated with a soft electronic beep. His company credit cards were collected. His office keys removed from his personal ring. As he walked toward the door, flanked by security, he stopped directly in front of me. His face was red, his hands shaking with suppressed rage, but for the first time in our acquaintance, Richard Granger had absolutely nothing to say. The man who'd built his career on intimidation and verbal cruelty stood mute before the girl he'd called a loser just 2 hours earlier. I watched him leave in silence, feeling not triumph but a deep, quiet satisfaction. Justice, it turned out, was worth the wait. The silence that followed Granger's departure hung over the office like smoke after a fire. I stood in the hallway outside the boardroom, watching employees peek around corners and whisper in hushed clusters, their faces mixing disbelief with something that looked dangerously close to hope. Brad appeared beside me, his presence calm and steady. "Ready for the hard part?" he asked quietly. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Removing Granger had been surgical, precise, the culmination of months of careful planning. What came next would be messier, more complex, requiring patience and genuine leadership rather than strategic maneuvering. We started immediately. Tuesday morning, I walked into what had been Granger's corner office, now temporarily serving as a neutral meeting space, and found Maria, the night cleaning supervisor, waiting nervously by the door. "Ms. Logan," she began, then caught herself. "I mean Madison. I don't know if I should be here, but—" "You absolutely should be here," I said, gesturing to the chair across from the desk. "Tell me what's on your mind." For the next 20 minutes, Maria described a company culture that existed in shadows. Employees working unpaid overtime because they were too afraid to leave on time, maintenance requests that were ignored until equipment became dangerous, a suggestion box that led directly to a trash can. "People are scared to hope," she said finally. "We've seen new management before. They promise change, then 6 months later, everything goes back to the way it was." Her words hit harder than any of Granger's insults ever had. These people had been betrayed by hope before. Earning their trust would require more than speeches or policy changes. It would demand consistent action, day after day, until belief replaced cynicism. By Thursday, word had spread that Brad and I were holding open office hours. People were hesitant at first, approaching with the tentative steps of animals who'd been kicked too many times. But gradually, one by one, employees began stepping forward. James from IT came first, carrying a laptop bag and speaking in measured tones about system security vulnerabilities that had been ignored for months. "I've been documenting everything," he said, producing a flash drive. "Every time I reported a problem, every time I was told to work around it, every near miss that could have compromised our entire network." Sarah from accounting arrived with trembling hands and a story about being forced to manipulate quarterly reports to hide budget shortfalls. "I never wanted to lie," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But I have a mortgage, and he said if I didn't cooperate." One by one they came, with ideas that had been dismissed without consideration, with concerns that had been buried under corporate doublespeak, with tears for colleagues who'd been driven away, with hugs that conveyed 8 months of suppressed gratitude. Each conversation revealed another layer of systematic dysfunction that Granger had either created or allowed to fester. But more importantly, each person who walked through that door represented a piece of the company's soul that had somehow survived years of toxic leadership. The most emotional moment came on Friday afternoon when Lisa Martinez appeared in my doorway. The single mother Granger had fired was back, officially reinstated with full benefits and back pay, but she looked fragile, uncertain. "I don't understand," she said, settling into the chair with careful movements. "Why would you bring me back? My project really did go over budget." "By 3%, Brad said, joining us with Lisa's file in hand. "Due to material cost increases that were completely outside your control. In any reasonable workplace, that would have been a minor budget adjustment, not grounds for termination." Lisa stared at the reinstatement letter for a long moment before looking up with eyes bright with unshed tears. "My kids, they'll be able to keep their health insurance?" "Retroactively," I assured her. "Everything's been restored." That afternoon, Brad and I implemented our first major policy change. The hiring and promotion process would now focus exclusively on merit and qualifications, with multiple oversight layers to prevent favoritism or discrimination. Every position would be posted internally first, giving current employees opportunities for advancement that had been arbitrarily denied under Granger's reign. But the real work wasn't happening in policy meetings. It was happening in the daily interactions that slowly rebuilt trust. Brad and I established a routine of walking the floors every day, not as executives surveying their domain, but as colleagues checking in with teammates. The transformation in people's behavior was gradual but unmistakable. Where employees had once hurried past with downcast eyes, they now looked up and made eye contact. Where conversations had once stopped abruptly when management appeared, people now continued talking, even inviting us to join discussions about workflow improvements or client concerns. Madison became the standard greeting instead of Ms. Logan. People used my actual name, spoke to me as a person rather than a position, and gradually began sharing ideas they'd been harboring for years. The board members' reactions proved more complex and politically nuanced. Harold Brennan approached me privately on Wednesday, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expensive suit immaculate. "I want you to know that I had no idea about the extent of Richard's irregularities," he said carefully. "If there's anything I can do to support the transition." I listened politely, noting the careful phrasing, the strategic positioning. Some board members, like Harold, were genuinely trying to align themselves with the new leadership. Others, like Margaret Chin, offered professional competence without emotional investment. A few remained distant, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden shift in power dynamics. "We appreciate your support," I told each of them, making no commitments, harboring no illusions. Loyalty built in panic rarely survives the return of calm. Real trust would be proven over time, through consistent actions rather than convenient words. The most meaningful change wasn't visible in spreadsheets or policy documents. It was in the atmosphere of the office itself. Laughter returned to break room conversations. People stayed late by choice rather than fear. Innovation replaced the grinding compliance that had characterized Granger's era. One afternoon, while organizing my new office, I discovered something that stopped me cold. Tucked in the back of a desk drawer was a birthday card. Handmade, decorated with awkward drawings and filled with signatures from my former colleagues. "Happy birthday, Madison," read the cover in cheerful letters. Inside, someone had written, "Thanks for always being so kind," in careful script. Another person had added, "Hope this year brings you everything you deserve." It was unsigned, forgotten, never delivered. Probably hidden when Granger's announcement had shattered the celebration before it could begin. I sat staring at that card for several minutes, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The months of careful planning, the systematic documentation of injustice, the calculated patience that had finally yielded justice. Taking a black marker from my desk, I wrote across the bottom in bold letters, "Never again." Then I pinned it on my office wall, right next to my diplomas and certificates. A reminder that power without compassion was just tyranny with better business cards. The revolution was complete. Now came the harder work of building something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. 3 months after Granger's departure, the brass nameplate arrived. I watched the facilities manager carefully mount it beside my door. Madison Logan, Executive Director. The letters catching the afternoon light streaming through the hallway windows. Unlike Granger's intimidating fortress with its thick mahogany barriers and imposing leather furniture, my office reflected a different philosophy entirely. I'd replaced his massive executive desk with a simple glass table that created no physical barriers between myself and visitors. The door remained open from 7 a.m. until 6 p.m., a standing invitation that had initially confused employees but gradually became the symbol of everything we were building. "Transparency isn't a slogan," I'd told Brad during our first leadership meeting. "It's a decision we make every single day." The morning after the nameplate installation, I arrived to find a small crowd gathered in the hallway, employees reading my name with expressions that ranged from satisfaction to quiet joy. Maria, the night cleaning supervisor, caught my eye and simply nodded, a gesture of approval that meant more than any board resolution. My father called that evening, his timing impeccable as always. I was reviewing quarterly reports when his familiar voice filled my office through the speakerphone. "How does it feel?" he asked without preamble. "Different than I expected," I admitted, leaning back in my chair. "Heavier." "Good. Power should feel heavy. When it feels light, you're not using it right." I told him about the changes we'd implemented, the employees we'd reinstated, the culture shifts that were slowly taking root. He listened without interruption, occasionally humming in approval. "Your mother would have been proud," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. Those 5 words hit me like a physical blow. Throughout 8 months of careful planning, through Granger's public humiliation, through the boardroom confrontation and everything that followed, I'd maintained perfect emotional control. But sitting there in my new office, surrounded by the evidence of justice finally served, I broke. The tears came suddenly and completely, months of suppressed emotion pouring out in quiet sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for my mother, who taught me that patience was a weapon sharper than anger. I cried for every employee who'd suffered under Granger's tyranny. I cried for the girl I'd pretended to be and the woman I'd finally become. It was the only time I cried during the entire ordeal, and somehow that made it perfect. Work with Brad had evolved into something I hadn't anticipated. A genuine partnership built on mutual respect and complementary skills. Where I excelled at strategic planning and long-term vision, he brought technical expertise and an intuitive understanding of operational efficiency. We'd established a rhythm of collaboration that felt natural, almost telepathic. Tuesday mornings became our standing meeting time, not in a formal conference room but walking through different departments, observing workflows, listening to concerns. We rarely discussed the events that brought us together, but occasionally, especially on Mondays, we'd exchange a look across a meeting table, a shared understanding of the journey that led to this moment. "Remember when you used to bring me coffee?" I asked him one afternoon as we reviewed budget projections. "You mean when I was gathering intelligence on our primary target while maintaining operational cover?" He replied with a slight smile. "You could have just said yes. Where's the fun in that?" These moments of levity punctuated days filled with serious work. Rebuilding systems, restructuring departments, healing wounds that had festered for years under Granger's leadership. The most significant personal ritual I'd established was my birthday observance. Unlike the corporate-mandated celebrations of the past, I now took my birthday as a genuine personal day. But before leaving the office each year, I made a pilgrimage to the same break room where Granger had delivered his final insult. Standing there on my second post-Granger birthday, I studied the space with fresh eyes. Someone had repainted the walls a warmer shade of blue. New tables created better conversation areas. A suggestion box, a real one with a lock and weekly reviews, sat prominently on the counter. I wasn't there for cake or celebration. I came to remember where the fire was lit, to honor the moment when humiliation transformed into determination. The break room had become my personal shrine to the power of patience and the inevitability of justice. In my office, carefully positioned on a shelf visible from my desk, sat the cardboard box Granger had given me 8 months earlier. Inside, preserved like museum artifacts, were the 4 items I'd selected during my performative departure. The access badge that had granted me more power than he'd ever known, the pen that had documented his downfall, the photo of my parents that had anchored my resolve, and my coded notebook filled with months of careful observations. Last week I'd added one final item, a handwritten note on company letterhead that read simply, "Happy birthday, Madison. You won." But winning, I'd discovered, was more complex than I'd anticipated. Victory wasn't the moment Granger walked out in defeat. It was watching Sarah from accounting present a budget proposal with confidence instead of fear. It was seeing James from IT implement security protocols without worrying about retaliation. It was Maria telling me about her daughter's college acceptance, knowing she could now afford the tuition thanks to the overtime pay that was finally being calculated correctly. The real victory was in the small moments that accumulated over time. Employees calling me by my first name, genuine laughter echoing through hallways, innovative ideas flowing freely without fear of theft or ridicule. Late Friday afternoon, as I prepared to leave for the weekend, I found a new addition to my office. Someone had left a small potted plant on my desk, a peace lily with a note attached. "Thank you for helping us grow." The Friday afternoon cleanup crew. I smiled, recognizing the handwriting as Maria's, and placed the plant on my windowsill where it would catch the morning sun. Growth, I realized, was happening everywhere now. In policies, in people, in the very DNA of the organization. The girl nobody had noticed had become the woman everybody respected. But more importantly, the company nobody had cared about was becoming a place where people could thrive. As I locked my office and headed for the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished nameplate beside my door. Madison Logan, Executive Director. The title felt right now, not because of the power it represented but because of the responsibility it carried. My mother would have been proud. And for the first time since her death I was proud too. The elevator doors closed, carrying me toward whatever came next, but I no longer worried about the future. We'd built something worth protecting, something that would outlast any individual leader. The revolution was complete. The kingdom was secure. And justice, finally, had found its home. If this story of calculated revenge had you cheering for justice, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Madison revealed her true identity in that boardroom, watching Granger's face crumble in real time. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more satisfying revenge stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.